Okay, so let's get started with the axial skeleton, the skull. The skull has two parts, the cranium and the face, which I already started talking about. The cranium is composed of 8 bones that make a complete bony eggshell around the egg of the brain. I don't quite like that analogy because it makes it sound like the cranium is fragile, like an eggshell, but it's not. It is extremely hard and dense. You've all been hit in the head, and you know that although it certainly hurts, it does not crack your head unless you've been hit really, really hard. But I digress. Anyway, the face is composed of 14 bones. The skull has 7 associated bones. The 6 auditory ossicles in the cranium, 3 on each side. These are just the middle ear bones, so not so bad. That 1 hyoid bone inferior to the skull under the mandible. We're going to break it down. So the skull, the cranium, and we're going to start talking about the bones of the cranium that completely surround the brain. So the frontal, the parietal, and the occipital bones will be discussed first. So the cranium can be learned in a sequence that starts with the frontal bone and moves posteriorly to the parietal bones and the occipital bone as though combing back your hair. Pass inferiorly and anteriorly with the occipital bone, then move superiorly and anteriorly to the sphenoid and ethmoid bones, and you're done. And then lastly, clap the temporal bones on the sides of the cranium like earmuffs. And I've drawn a little map here of us going from the frontal bone to the parietal bone to the occipital bone to the sphenoid bone, which is purple here, and the ethmoid bone, which is green, and then the temporal bones, which are orange or pink, and they are clapped on the side like earmuffs. I think it's a nice way to learn, and no students ever told me it's a bad way to learn, so hopefully it'll help you. The frontal bone forms the forehead and the superior roof of the orbits or eye sockets, and I have a lot of pictures here to help you learn what the frontal bone looks like. First, starting in the far left, in orange, the frontal bone is shown in its relation to the rest of the skull, and then we see it in an anterior view and in an inferior view of the orbits. So kind of peeking under what we saw in the anterior view and looking at the orbits. And then an internal view from the posterior, looking frontward and also at the interior view. So if we think of the skull as a bowl that you could put soup in or something, we're looking inside the curvature of the bowl. We're looking inside the bowl. So if it had soup in it, we'd be looking at the soup, but we ate all the soup, and now we're looking at the inside of the bowl. Huh. Okay. So then moving posteriorly, we get to the parietal bones that form the roof and the sides of the cranium. So here, and they're kind of boring to look at. They don't have many features. Then the occipital bone that forms the posterior of and the inferior base of the cranium. So if you put your hands on the back of your neck, like when you're resting on a towel, looking up at the stars at night, something like that. I don't know. You're holding your occipital bone. If you have a low ponytail, your low ponytail would be tied off at the occipital bone. So that's where the occipital bone is. It contains the foramen magnum, which means the large hole that the spinal cord passes through. It forms 2 joints with first cervical vertebrae at the occipital condyles. So the occipital bone has what are called occipital condyles. And remember, condyles were like a smooth part of a bone that's found in a joint. And here you see them in a cartoon, the occipital condyles, and over here you see them on a real bone. In this little cartoon to the far left, they're showing you the occipital bone from an inferior view. We're seeing the upper jaw with the upper teeth. So we know that we're looking at the inferior of the skull with the mandible removed. So with the lower jaw, which comes off, removed, so that we can just look at the inferior skull without the mandible in the way. You could have left it also, no problem. And that's how we're looking at the occipital bone in the picture to the left, with the foramen magnum shown and then the occipital condyle shown. And then we go to the picture that is a very small little picture of the skull, sort of just right to the middle of the slide. And now we're looking into the soup bowl because we're looking at the internal view of the occipital bone. And of course, we're seeing the foramen magnum. Okay, moving on. So the next bone we're going to look at in the cranium is the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone, which will follow next, complete our trip around the cranium, except for clapping the temporal bones on like earmuffs. Both bones have complex shapes and functions. They're located behind the bones of the face in the area of the nose and the eyes. The sphenoid bone is posterior to the ethmoid bone. So we can look down here, and if we look at the sphenoid bone, it's colored in tan, and then the ethmoid bone is colored in yellow. And these pictures are nice and they're real, and they're helped a lot if we look at a sagittal section of the skull, giving us a left lateral view of the right half of the skull. And we see that we went from the front, the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, and now we've gotten to the sphenoid bone shown in purple and the ethmoid bone shown in green. And they're located in an area that's difficult for us to imagine because we never visualize it. It's the area that's behind the eyes and the nose, but hidden behind the anterior bones of the face. So it's a little difficult to visualize, which is why I spend so much time on these bones in the lecture, so that you will have some idea of how the skull is constructed by the time you leave the course. Okay. I'm not involving a lot of the bone markings that are included in some lectures on the skull because they, in my mind, are much less important than you understanding a overview of how the skull is put together. So these two bones are difficult to visualize, and again, they are behind the area of the eyes and the nose where we can't see them. So try to go and use all your magical three-dimensional powers to understand where the heck these bones are. I'll do my best to guide you. All right, so the sphenoid bone, hidden back there behind our eyes, and you see the sphenoid bone shown here in this little skull as the orange here, and that's showing that the sphenoid bone is in part the posterior wall of the orbit or the eye socket, but it does more. It articulates with and unites all of the cranial bones. Okay, think about that. And many of the bones of the face. It acts as a cross brace that strengthens the skull from side to side. So if you fall and you hit the side of your head, or somebody hits you on the side of your head, this helps to act as a cross brace so that your skull does not crack when it's hit from either side. These are the orbits shown in a drawing and then in a real bone. And now we'll talk about two bone markings. The optic canal is in the sphenoid bone, and it lets the optic nerves pass from the eyes, which are in the eye sockets. And the eyes have an optic nerve that has collected all the information from the retina in the back of the eye. And now that information has to be sent on the optic nerve into the brain. And it gets there by going through the optic canal. Now, you can't see the optic canal in this anterior picture because it's a little bit on the medial uh, wall of the sphenoid, but we'll be able to see it in the next picture when we're looking from the other side of the sphenoid bone. What we can see very well is the superior orbital fissure, which is a passageway for 4 cranial nerves that are coming from the brain and going to muscles in the eye socket. Okay, now we're on the other side of the sphenoid bone. So, again, thinking of a soup bowl, we're inside the part that would have the soup in it. So, the inner surface of the sphenoid bone contains a bony depression called the sella turcica that surrounds and protects the pituitary gland. Sella turcica means Turkish salad. Oh, I'm sorry, not Turkish saddle. Like back when people rode horses a lot, there was a special kind of saddle that Turkish people produced and used. All right, why is it so important to protect the pituitary gland with this deep bony depression? It's because the pituitary gland is the source of many, many of the hormones for the body. Not all of them, but many of the important hormones for the body. And here's a picture of the cranium from the right sort of lateral / anterior side. And we see the frontal bone in yellow, the parietal bone in purple, the occipital bone in sort of pink, purple, and then the sphenoid bone, that cross brace that goes from one side, here the right side, all the way across to the left side, acting as a cross brace across the skull, the sphenoid bone in orange. And next, we're going to do the ethmoid bone shown here in green. So, the skull, the cranium, the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone has a superior surface called the cribriform plate that completes the cranium. And, just a bit. The cribriform plate has many small holes, which is why it was named that, because cribrum is sieve in Latin. The branches of the olfactory nerves that sense smell in the nasal cavity pass through the cribriform plate to get into the part of the cranium that houses the brain. Once the olfactory nerves have passed through the cribriform plate, they synapse on the olfactory bulb, and we'll learn about their pathway in the nervous system. Their job is to sense smell. From the cranium, where the ethmoid bone only covers a small area, the ethmoid bone extends into the nasal cavity, and it forms the roof of the nasal cavity and other parts of the nasal cavity. So it's a very important part of the structure of the nasal cavity. It has a thin perpendicular plate that forms the superior part of the nasal septum, and the nasal septum actually divides the nasal cavity into a right and a left nasal cavity. The ethmoid bone contains the superior and middle nasal conchae. The main function of the nasal conchae is to increase the surface area of the nasal cavities, and that helps to warm and moisten the air in the nasal cavities before it passes to the lungs. So if we look here, the superior conchae are shown in a coronal section, looking anteriorly from a coronal section. And then the middle nasal conchae are shown below, and they are covered with epithelium that is moist and has a sort of mucus and water surface fluid on them. And as the air passes over, it's warmed by being in the internal nasal cavity and also moistened by the fluids that are on the epithelium that covers the conchae. Also shown in this coronal section are the perpendicular plate, which we just learned about, and the ethmoid air cells or sinuses. Now, this picture on the right, it's a lateral view. You're standing the left, you're looking at the right conchae, and we see the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha, and the perpendicular plate has been removed. We don't see that, okay? There is one feature that we didn't talk about yet called the crista galli. It's just a connective tissue anchoring structure. It anchors a connective tissue sheet inside the cranium. It's not really that interesting, except for it does stick up like a little coxcomb, which is what crista galli means in Latin, or like a little shark's fin. And it just helps us to orient when we look at the complex ethmoid bone separated from the skull. So not in situ, just if you were holding an ethmoid bone in your hand. It helps us to orient what is the anterior of the ethmoid bone because it's found anteriorly. There are olfactory receptors in the epithelium covering the inferior surfaces of the cribriform plate and the superior portion of the perpendicular plate and the medial surfaces of the superior nasal conchae. And here we're seeing the same picture of the skull I showed you with the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, the sphenoid bone, and then finally the ethmoid bone, which plays a little role in the cranium and a big role in the nasal cavity. Okay, we will complete the cranium with the temporal bone. So the temporal bone articulates with the parietal, occipital, and sphenoid bones of the cranium. It also articulates with two facial bones, the zygomatic bone to form the zygomatic arch and the mandible at the temporomandibular joint. So it really gets in touch with many, many bones, okay? It misses the frontal bone, but it articulates with the parietal, the occipital, and the sphenoid, misses the ethmoid, okay? Then it articulates with the zygomatic bone, which we'll learn, and the mandible, which we'll learn in the next section. The temporal bone contains the external auditory meatus and the auditory canal. The auditory canal leads from the external auditory meatus to the tympanic membrane or eardrum, and beyond the eardrum, the middle ear and the inner ear. And here in these pictures, we see the external auditory meatus in our cartoon. The temporal bones are on the side in orange. There's a hole in them. That's the external auditory meatus. Okay, then from the external auditory meatus, in we go into the auditory canal. We see that tympanic membrane. We see the middle ear with the three middle ear bones, and then the inner ear, which we'll learn more about. And then finally, an auditory tube going to the nasopharynx, which we will learn more about. So the middle ear contains the auditory ossicles, the malleus or hammer, the incus or anvil, and the stapes or stirrup. I think that they did a pretty good job of naming these, especially the stapes looks astonishingly like the stirrup that you put your foot in when you're riding a horse. And of course, back then, when they were naming these things, they had a lot of horses and stirrups, and they thought right away of a stirrup, but I think you will too when you look at the stapes bone. These tiny bones, they transfer sound vibrations from the tympanic membrane to receptors in the cochlea of the inner ear. And that's how sound is created. That's how the creation of sound starts in the middle ear. The inner ear also contains the semicircular canals that are involved in balance, so not in hearing, but in balance of the body. The temporal bone contains parts of or part of the auditory tube. The auditory tube leads from the middle ear to the nasopharynx. And I have the picture that we've been looking at showing the middle ear here in the center of this picture. On the left of the slide over here, showing the three bones of the middle ear. And then going from the middle ear, there's the auditory tube, not to be confused with the auditory canal, okay? Canal is from the external auditory meatus to the middle ear. Now, from the middle ear to the nasopharynx is the auditory tube. Easy to confuse. But then there are two other pictures. There's an anterior view where they've drawn a like kind of see-through picture of what you would see if you could look through the skin and the bone. You would see the auditory canal, the tympanic membrane, the middle ear with the three auditory ossicles, and then from the middle ear, the auditory tube going down until it got to the nasopharynx. And here is showing a sagittal view, left lateral. You're standing in the right, and you're looking at the left side of the left nasal cavity and the left nasopharynx, and right there is the opening of the auditory tube. And I'll talk a lot more about that later in the respiratory system as an explanation of how people get first a cold by inhaling a virus, and from there, how it can spread and become an ear infection or otitis media, infection of the middle ear, easily because of this connection between the auditory tube and the nasopharynx. The temporal bone has a mastoid process posterior to the ear. The mastoid process is the attachment site for the sternocleidomastoid muscle. That muscle is attached in three places. At the sternum, sternocleido is for clavicle, and at the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So that's where it gets its name from, the sternocleidomastoid muscle. The mastoid process contains mastoid sinuses or air spaces that are connected to the middle ear cavity and then to the nasopharynx. A person can also get an infection of the mastoid air cells or mastoid sinuses, again, by getting a cold, having it infect the nasal cavity, the nasopharynx, then going up the auditory tubes to the middle ear, and then possibly even beyond the middle ear to the mastoid process. And then that is difficult to treat. It's kind of difficult to deliver antibiotics to that area. So it's painful and unpleasant for people who that happens to. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone forms part of the zygomatic arch with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So I know that sounds like word salad. So look at the picture below and note the zygomatic arch. That is the cool thing. It is, in common parlance, the cheekbones, okay? But in order to memorize the rest, note temporal bone first. So temporal bone, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So this is something that belongs to the temporal bone, and it's just called the zygomatic process. And then the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, note that this is the zygomatic bone we're talking about. This is something owned by the zygomatic bone. It's the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So try to really look at of temporal bone, of zygomatic bone, to figure out what the heck these words mean here. The temporal bone has a pointed styloid process. It's really quite pointy. That is the attachment point for many tongue, pharynx, and larynx muscles. And here's our pointy styloid process, just anterior to the mastoid process. And on the left, I think it's a little bit covered up by all of the arrows pointing to it, but it's the pointy thing just anterior to the mastoid process. And here we're seeing it in a cartoon, and now they're showing you that it's a pointy process and that it's anterior to the mastoid process, and then they're showing you all of the muscles that are attached to the styloid process. Okay, some speech